1,000 years ago, China solved a problem that every trading civilization eventually runs into. Success had become too heavy to carry. In Sichuan, merchants were moving through a booming commercial world with strings of iron cash that could weigh more than the goods they were meant to buy. To settle a large transaction, you did not just need capital. You needed porters. You needed carts. You needed time. And in a world where distance was risk, weight was friction, and friction was cost, that was a monetary system already straining against its own success. Early paper notes emerged there as a practical escape from that burden, and within a generation the Song state moved to formalize and control issuance. This is what makes the story dangerous. Paper money did not begin as a fraud. It began as an efficiency breakthrough. It reduced transport costs, accelerated exchange, and helped support one of the most commercially advanced economies on Earth. That is the part modern discussions usually miss. Monetary collapse rarely starts with obvious corruption. It starts with a brilliant solution to a real problem. Then comes the irreversible turn. Once the state sees that trust itself can be standardized, printed, and scaled, money stops being only a measure of value. It becomes a fiscal instrument, a political resource. In peaceful years, that looks like administrative genius. In military emergencies, it becomes temptation, and that is the warning preserved in the forensic record of the Song. Not that paper money is doomed on day one, but that every paper system eventually reveals what it is made of when the survival of the regime collides with the discipline of the currency. In this story, that collision did not end in theory. It ended in ruined purchasing power, forced usage, and a population that fled back toward what paper promises could no longer buy. The first thing to understand is that Song paper money was not invented by philosophers, emperors, or central planners. It was invented by merchants who were trying to survive the physical stupidity of a growing economy. Sichuan was not using some elegant gold standard. It was heavily reliant on iron coinage, a legacy that made local trade workable at small scale, but punishing at commercial scale. When business expanded, the currency did not scale with it. Large payments required strings of iron cash so bulky and heavy that settlement itself became a transport problem. In practical terms, money had become a logistics burden. The very medium of exchange was obstructing exchange. So merchants improvised. They began depositing coin with trusted shops and issuing paper claims that could circulate instead of the metal itself. These early jiaozi were not born from ideology. They were warehouse receipts for a society whose commerce had outrun its coinage. This is how most durable financial innovations begin. Not with theory, but with friction. Someone finds a way to remove weight, delay, danger, or cost from a transaction, and the market rewards it immediately. And for a time it worked remarkably well. Under the Song, paper instruments helped lubricate one of the most commercially sophisticated economies in the world. The broader Song economy was marked by deep market integration, expanding urbanization, and unusually high levels of trade for its time. Paper claims fit naturally into that environment because they allowed value to move faster than metal. They made long-distance trade easier, reduced transport risk, and allowed merchants to think in larger scale. Convenience was not cosmetic here. It was productive. But convenience alone does not create trust. What made early paper money viable was discipline. The system operated under issuance rules, expiry structures, fees, and a relationship to real stores of value that gave the notes credibility. The public did not accept paper because paper is magical. They accepted it because they believed the claim was bounded, redeemable in practice, or constrained in issue, and backed by an authority that still feared losing credibility. In other words, paper worked only while trust remained scarcer than the notes themselves. That was the golden age of fiat-like money. Not infinite flexibility, but controlled substitution, and this is where the pattern becomes modern. A monetary system is strongest not when it can print the most, but when it still remembers what it is not allowed to do, because the moment a government looks at a trusted private innovation and asks not, how do we preserve its discipline, but How do we expand its usefulness to the state? The nature of money changes. It stops being a claim within limits. It becomes policy. This is the moment every monetary history turns from innovation into power, not when paper is invented. When the state takes control of it, the original brilliance of Jiaozi was that it emerged from a specific commercial bottleneck and survived because trust had to be earned. A merchant who issued too much would fail. A shop that could not honor its claim would be abandoned. Discipline was not moral. It was enforced by loss of reputation, loss of business, and, eventually, extinction. The state changes that equation. Once government absorbs a monetary instrument, it inherits the appearance of trust without necessarily preserving the conditions that created it. That is the pattern. Interrupt at the center of this story. What happens when a brilliant private sector solution becomes a state monopoly? The answer is not immediate collapse. The answer is something more dangerous, a period of apparent success that teaches the authorities the wrong lesson. At first, the Song government looked competent doing this. Standardized paper notes were easier to supervise, easier to tax around, easier to push across a wider territory, and easier to integrate into a complex commercial economy than mountains of iron cash. On the surface, this looked like progress, and in one sense it was. The state had taken a useful innovation and scaled it. But scale changes incentives. A merchant issues paper to facilitate trade. A government discovers it can issue paper to facilitate itself. That difference matters more than almost any design feature in monetary history, because once issuance power moves into the hands of a state, the currency is no longer judged only by whether it serves commerce. It is judged by whether it can absorb political pressure. Can it cover fiscal shortfalls? Can it smooth over tax weakness? Can it keep the army paid one more season? Can it buy time when reality becomes unaffordable? That is the hidden mutation. The note may look the same in the hand, but the logic behind its creation is now completely different, and for a while the public may not notice. That is how paper systems die, not in one loud betrayal, but in a sequence of quiet redefinitions. First, paper is a receipt. Then it is a convenience. Then it is an official instrument. Then it is an indispensable instrument. And finally, in crisis, it becomes a compulsory instrument. At each stage, the state tells itself it is merely adapting to necessity. But necessity is where monetary restraint goes to die. The Song court did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy its currency for sport. It faced real pressures, real borders, real enemies, and real fiscal demands. That is exactly why this case matters. Monetary collapse does not require irrational actors. It only requires a government that decides its immediate survival matters more than the long-term integrity of the unit. And once that threshold is crossed, paper stops representing stored trust. It starts consuming it. War is where monetary theory meets appetite. The Song state did not lose discipline in a vacuum. It lost discipline under pressure, northern threats, frontier instability, and the escalating cost of defense created the classic fiscal trap that has destroyed far newer regimes than this one. Armies had to be fed before harvests arrived. Garrisons had to be paid before taxes were collected. Horses, grain, weapons, transport, fortifications, and emergency mobilization all demanded resources in the present, while the real economy could only produce them over time. Paper closes that gap. At first, this looks almost harmless. A government expands issuance temporarily. It tells itself the emergency is exceptional. It believes growth, victory, or future revenues will normalize the imbalance later. This is always the seduction. Printing does not feel like confiscation when it begins. No doors are kicked in. No property is seized in public squares. The transfer happens more quietly. The unit itself is diluted. That is why overissue is politically attractive. It is taxation without the spectacle of taxation. And once reserve discipline weakens, the arithmetic becomes brutal. More notes begin chasing the same grain, the same labor, the same metal, the same cloth. Prices rise, but not evenly. That detail matters. Inflation never lands like a clean textbook ratio. It arrives unevenly, by corridor, by city, by class, by necessity. The court pays suppliers with paper. Suppliers raise prices. Soldiers are paid in nominal terms that look intact, then discover their wages buy less each month. Urban households feel it first in staple goods. Traders respond faster than officials. Those closest to market reality shorten credit, demand better terms, or move into harder stores of value. Those who live on fixed income, salaries, or delayed payments are trapped. This is how a 90% loss of purchasing power becomes socially visible, not as an abstract chart, but as a sequence of humiliations. A merchant who once accepted paper freely now asks for more notes for the same shipment. A family that could afford lamp oil and grain now cuts one to preserve the other. A soldier receives payment on time and still cannot provision his household. The note remains legal. It remains official. It may even remain numerically abundant, but its social authority is draining away. And when that happens, governments usually make the same mistake. They treat the public's refusal as the problem. Instead of asking why people are fleeing the currency, they ask how to stop them. That is the second phase of fiat failure. First, the state overissues to survive. Then it criminalizes or suppresses the market's response to overissue. The problem is no longer merely inflation. The problem becomes compulsion. Because once people discover that official money is weaker than real goods, they do what human beings have always done. They begin choosing goods, metal, grain, cloth, land, anything with use beyond decree. And that is where paper systems become dangerous to their own populations, not when they weaken. When the state notices that people can tell, by the time the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty consolidated power, the lesson should have been obvious. It was not. Instead of treating paper as a tool that required restraint, the Yuan rulers pushed further into monetary coercion. They issued paper currency on a large scale and repeatedly attempted to make it the center of exchange, while also moving against the public's escape routes. In different periods, private use of gold and silver was restricted or suppressed in order to strengthen paper circulation and fiscal control. This is the pattern in its purest form. Once trust decays, the state tries to replace trust with prohibition. That never solves the underlying problem. Because gold and silver are not dangerous to the state because they are shiny, they are dangerous because they provide an exit. They allow households, merchants, and regional networks to compare the official unit against something the court cannot manufacture at will. The moment that comparison becomes politically intolerable, monetary history enters its coercive phase. And ordinary people understand this long before court historians do. When paper weakens, society does not debate it academically. It adapts. Payments are shortened. Contracts are repriced. Hoarding increases. Better goods disappear from open sale. Rural exchange hardens into direct negotiation. Urban trade becomes two-tiered, the official price and the real price. One exists on paper. The other is what you actually have to surrender to get food, transport, labor, or imported goods. That is what monetary breakdown looks like at street level. Not apocalypse. Distortion. A system still functioning administratively while failing economically. By the early Ming, the authorities effectively absorbed the lesson the hard way. The dynasty did experiment with paper. But over time, large-scale confidence in it eroded so badly that the Chinese economy increasingly settled back onto silver, especially uncoined silver measured by weight. The state did not ceremonially announce that paper had failed, as a civilization-scale promise. It simply lost the ability to make people trust it as a store of value. Commerce migrated toward what held purchasing power better. That is the final humiliation of a broken fiat regime. The public does not overthrow it in one dramatic gesture. They route around it. So where does that leave the modern dollar? Not at the end of the script, but at the point of comparison. The dollar is not Song Dynasty. The United States is not medieval China.